This review contrasts Abdulaziz Sachedina's and William Talbot's optimistic, ethics, and reason-based theories of human rights with Ahmed Suwaya's critical, systems-based approach, challenges the idea that moral or intellectual progress reduces abuses, arguing instead that human rights violations are systemic, rooted in structural power dynamics and motivations like greed or domination. He advocates for pragmatic systems designed to address and mitigate harm, shifting focus from ideals to structural accountability. Let's start with the idea of Jahiliyyah, a time frame usually cited as a turning point by Muslim thinkers. Why is this event so significant for discussions about justice and rights?
The end of Jahiliyyah, traditionally seen as the age of ignorance before Islam, marks not just a religious transformation, but a profound moral shift. Scholars like Abdulaziz Sachedina argue that the Quran introduced a new ethical consciousness centered on human dignity, justice, and accountability that resonates with modern human rights.
That's fascinating. So, does the Quran directly address issues we now associate with human rights, such as equality and protection for marginalized groups?
Absolutely. For instance, Quran 17:70 proclaims the honor of all children of Adam, emphasizing universal human worth regardless of background. Sachedina interprets this as a foundational statement of equality, bridging religious, ethnic, and gender divides. The Quran's message was as much social and ethical as theological.
Yet, as we transition to later periods, how did this early ethical vision fare when confronted with real political power?
That's where tensions arise. Over time, the dynamic moral vision of the Quran was often constrained by rigid legalism and political interests. While the Prophet's message inspired ideals, subsequent Islamic governance frequently prioritized authority over justice, leading to a gap between ethical aspirations and historical realities.
Moving from the Islamic tradition, let's shift to Western frameworks. The Enlightenment is often credited with birthing modern human rights. How did Enlightenment thinkers conceptualize these rights?
Enlightenment philosophers like Locke, Kant, and Rousseau championed reason as the basis for moral and political order. They argued for universal principles liberty, equality, and justice grounded not in tradition or divine command, but in rational deliberation. William Talbot, a modern thinker, sees this as the start of a process of moral discovery.
But the Enlightenment era also saw egregious abuse of slavery, colonialism, and exclusion. How do scholars like Talbot reconcile these contradictions?
Talbot acknowledges these contradictions, noting that many Enlightenment figures espoused lofty ideals while excluding women, enslaved people, and indigenous populations. He argues that these failings were not just vestiges of the past, but structural limitations of their societies. For Talbot, moral progress depends on critical public discourse and expanding the circle of moral concern.
So, is it accurate to say that both Islamic and Enlightenment traditions contain ideals that often clash with their own histories of exclusion and abuse?
Exactly. Both traditions offer powerful ethical foundations but have struggled, in practice, to realize their promises. The historical record is replete with examples where the rhetoric of rights served to justify, rather than prevent, oppression. This contradiction is central to the critique offered by newer scholars.
Building on these traditions, Ahmed Suwaya, pronounced Suwaya, presents a forceful critique. What distinguishes Suwaya's approach to human rights from those of Sachedina and Talbot?
Dr. Suwaya departs sharply from moral idealism. Rather than viewing rights abuses as lapses in reason or ethics, he sees them as persistent structural features of all societies. He introduces a systems thinking framework suggesting that abuses stem from deep, interconnected biological, social, and political forces, not just from failures of values or knowledge.
That's a significant shift. Can you elaborate on how this systems perspective changes our understanding of human rights violations?
Sure. Instead of focusing on individual motives or ideological justifications, Suwaya distinguishes between motivation and justification. For example, colonialism wasn't truly driven by civilizing paternalism, but by deeper motivations: greed, fear, and the pursuit of power. Justifications simply mask these underlying drivers, making abuses seem morally acceptable.
So, in practical terms, does this mean that no amount of moral reasoning can truly prevent abuses?
Precisely. Professor Sui Eya argues that moral reasoning alone is inadequate. To address rights violations, we need systemic diagnostic examining how economic, political, and cultural systems interact to produce and normalize harm. This approach encourages interventions that target the root architecture of abuse, not merely its ethical surface.
With Professor Sui Eya's critique in mind, let's discuss actionable paths forward. If rights violations are systemic, how does this reframe the purpose and practice of human rights advocacy?
Dr. Sui Eya reframes human rights as tools for managing the risks inherent in governance, rather than as moral trophies. He suggests designing systems with built-in checks mechanisms that anticipate, constrain, and correct abuses of power. This is akin to engineering safety features into complex machinery, rather than hoping for perfect operation through goodwill alone.
That analogy helps clarify the shift. How might this approach handle the challenge of cultural and religious diversity without slipping into relativism?
By focusing on measurable patterns of harm rather than on achieving moral consensus, Sui Eya's framework sidesteps relativism. It allows for pluralism in values while maintaining a universal commitment to reducing harm. This is similar to public health models, which respect cultural differences yet insist on certain standards to prevent disease.
Looking to real-world application, what would a systems-oriented human rights reform look like?
It would involve mapping the flow of power and incentives in institutions, identifying where harm is likely to occur, and building in corrective mechanisms. For example, independent oversight bodies, transparent reporting, and adaptive policy design can help realign systems to minimize abuse. The focus shifts from idealistic declarations to empirical accountability.